May be seated. So, as you well know, this evening begins that ninth day of Av, holiday in Hebrew, Tisha B'Av, simply ninth day of Av. Its name is its date, because the date is so powerful, so famous. It happens to fall out this year on Saturday night. Sometimes it falls out on Shabbat, and you can't observe a day of mourning on Shabbat. Yom Kippur, although we fast, is not a day of mourning. The fasting has a completely different purpose. Here, the fasting is meant as an act of mourning. So it can begin on Saturday night, which it does. Sometimes when it falls to Shabbat, we push it to Saturday night. But this is actually the ninth day of Av. So first, let's look at the history. How did this day become the day that it is and has been for quite a period of time, a day of mourning? So first of all, it commemorates catastrophic events in Jewish history. Most notably, the destruction of both the first temple, that was by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, and second temple in 70 CE. In between that period of time, after the first destruction, the exile ended rather quickly. After 70 years, Cyrus, the Persians, defeat the Babylonians and invite the people of Israel to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem, to return to the land of Israel. He didn't do it because he did it for Jews. He did it for every nation that had been conquered by the Babylonians. He freed them and gave them permission to remain within the empire, but to live their own lives, worship as they pleased. It was a laissez-faire. They invented laissez-faire government. Obey our rules, obey your own rules, loyalty, pay your taxes, don't rebel, and we'll all get along just fine. The second exile was 2,000 years. So that destruction of the second temple is the one that there's more focus on because its impact was much longer lasting than the first one. But it also commemorates, Tisha B'Av, the fall of Beitar during the Bar Kokhba revolt. So remember, the first revolt against Rome ended in the year 70 with the destruction of the temple. But the exile, although there was an exile, it wasn't complete. It wasn't total. Jews remained in the land of Israel, which the Romans, to punish the people of Israel, took away the name Israel and renamed it Palestine because of the Philistines that used to live there, and to humiliate the Jewish people by not allowing them to even refer to their own land by its own name. So a second revolt took place in the year 135. That's the famous Bar Kokhba revolt, the one who was seen as a messianic figure, even by Rabbi Akiba himself, led a revolt against Rome. This exile was even more extensive, and the destruction was complete, and the community in the land of Israel began to diminish in numbers and importance, and it shifted to Babylonia over the next few centuries, which is why when you study Talmud, what do you study? The Babylonian Talmud. Scholars study the Palestinian Talmud. It never was completed in terms of editing, so it's a very difficult text. So that was the Beitar, the fall of Beitar on the 9th of Av. So now we have a third destruction, not of the temple, but of the population of the land of Israel, and a much more extensive exile. It also is said that the expulsion in 1492 was on Tisha B'Av. And other tragedies, what happens is it becomes one of these quote-unquote self-fulfilling prophecies. So that the Nazis during World War II, knowing that the ninth day of Av was coming, because they knew a lot about Judaism, decided to turn it into a ninth day of Av for their own victims, for their own Jewish victims, and they would carry out specific pogroms and murders and terrible crimes against the Jewish people on Tisha B'Av to help them commemorate that horrible day. So Tisha B'Av became a day that our enemies focused on to heap more punishment and more tragedy upon us. So that's the history of the holiday. So with that, the rabbis had to come upon a way to mark the occasion. How do you observe it? Right? Every holiday, how do you do the Sukkot? You get in the Sukkah. Hanukkah, you light the menorah. What do you do on a day that you're commemorating a destruction of your sovereignty, the loss of your sovereignty, and the destruction of the symbol of that sovereignty, which was the temple? So they decided to have a day of fasting and to chant the Book of Lamentations. And a special trope was created. The cantor will tell us a little bit more about that tonight. It's a very mournful type of trope. 5 chapters that were written by one person or people. We don't know if every chapter was written by the same person, who actually experienced that moment, the destruction of the first temple, not the second. Lamentations is from the first temple, but the destruction is no different. The suffering and the torment and the exile was true in both destructions. And then they added on certain prohibitions that are normative to mourning. Bathing only for hygienic purposes, avoidance of wearing leather shoes because leather was considered very, it was high level, it was expensive, it was comfort. Leather was comfort, and therefore you avoided unnecessary comfort. And no study of Torah, because study of Torah is joyful. So the only thing you can do is study Torah that relates to the laws of mourning, or telling the story of the destruction. But Torah Lishma, just to sit down and study Torah for enjoyment, that was not permitted as well. And then added certain customs of sitting on the floor when chanting, if you're able to do it. Sitting is very easy. It's not the issue. It's getting up. Right? That's the question, how you get up after you sit. So those who can get up, I never say those who can sit. Everybody can sit. Those who are able to get up after the sitting should sit on the floor when chanting the Book of Lamentations. And the liturgy changes a bit during the service. We also will remove, after Shabbat, or push to the side, the decorative parochet, that which decorates the ark, because we don't have special decorations in our synagogues, which remind us of the temple. Prior to Tisha B'Av, we had 3 weeks. 3 weeks of mourning. Why? From the 17th day of Tammuz, when the walls were breached. Once the walls were breached, you knew the end was coming. Because once they got in, the outside walls, then the inside walls would eventually collapse as well, and they would breach them, and that would bring the destruction. So the 3 weeks of mourning, that's why there have been no weddings the last 3 weeks, and avoidance of any special celebrations. I mentioned last night that there was a debate in recent years, once Israel was established, as whether Tisha B'Av should continue to be observed. Like, how do you mourn the loss of your sovereignty when you have your sovereignty? Shouldn't you be celebrating your sovereignty and not mourning the loss that took place thousands of years ago? And so the different movements responded differently. The Orthodox movement maintained Tisha B'Av 100% the same way. Said, doesn't matter, we have a state of Israel, we still have to remember that we once lost our state. And they had a very good point, right? If you don't remember you once lost the state, you may not be as careful as preserving the present state that you have. The Reform movement initially, not so true today, but initially eliminated the observance 100%. There was no Tisha B'Av. Why? Because we have a state of Israel. Let's not live in the past. Let's not mourn something that happened so many decades or so many centuries ago. Let's focus on the fact that we have the land of Israel, and Tisha B'Av disappeared. It's now returned in different forms to the Reform movement. Conservative came up with the solution that we usually do, and that is right down the middle. And that was, we observe Tisha B'Av, but we cut the fast short because we have the state of Israel. So Tisha B'Av is observed until 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Then we put on tefillin, because you don't put on tefillin in the morning, and then the fast can be broken. So that was the compromise. Remember what happened? Don't forget that we're living in the greatest period of time of Jewish history in 2,000 years, living with a sovereign, independent Jewish state. What was the cause of these destructions? Well, on a historical level, superficially, just take it straightforward, we lost. That was the cause. Why was there a war? In both cases, Babylonia and Rome, the rule of Babylonia, we were a vassal to Babylonia, became so oppressive in terms of taxation, insult to our religious traditions, imposing cultural norms on us that we weren't comfortable with, that a revolt took place in order to throw off the yoke of Babylonian and Roman rule. In both cases, it was, on a military level, a very poor and unwise choice. Fighting against the Babylonians or fighting against the Romans really was not something that anyone could possibly think they could win. But religiously, they thought that they would be able to win because God will fight for us. We just read in the Torah reading today, God is always fighting for us. That's how we got into the land of Israel. But their judgment was incorrect, and the destruction came in both cases, quite an enormous destruction. So how did they interpret that loss? And this is the key to the survival of the Jewish people. Prior to the monotheistic idea, the belief in one God, interpreting a loss was really easy, right? Every nation had its own God. Every province could have its own God. So if you lose the war, there's a simple explanation. Their God was stronger than our God. So maybe what we ought to do is worship their God because he won. Simple explanation. It's not that you're right. It's not that you're wrong, morally or historically. It's simply that your God was unable to stand up to their God. And so you might give up on your God and worship their God. And very often you also gave up on that part of your religion. It's polytheism, so you can just choose another God. And culturally, they began to give up as well, which is why all these nations disappeared. They didn't try and preserve themselves. Once they were conquered, they just assimilated and disappeared into that polytheistic religion, which allowed you to switch gods based upon the historical circumstances. But the Jews had a problem. We brought this idea that seems so simple, but it's extremely complicated because it creates a lot of philosophical problems. There's only one God. Their God didn't defeat my God because there's only one God. So why did I lose? Why didn't my God the one God protect me? And that's how they had to deal with the situation. They had to come up with an interpretation that allowed them to understand what had occurred and to build a new future, because becoming a polytheist, giving up and just saying, well, maybe I was wrong and their God is stronger than my God. Did some do it? Of course they did. It's just that their books are not in the Bible, right? They disappeared from Jewish history. They gave it up. But a core number of people didn't give it up, and we bounce back each and every time. So how did they interpret it? Well, the first temple they interpreted very much, as Alan explained, Isaiah's description of what was going on. He described a nation that had fallen backwards in terms of their morality, in terms of how they worshiped their God, but mainly in terms of how they treated each other and their lack of pursuit of justice and corruption. God looked and said, you're not obeying my commandments. Where's the justice? Where's the tzedakah? Where's the compassion? You don't deserve this land anymore because you have abandoned the covenant. You've turned away from the commandments. And so I'm going to punish you. And that's how the prophets interpreted it, and therefore it was a very simple solution. How can I get God back on my side so that I can thrive again, establish a new state of Israel, a new sovereign state? And the answer is very clear. Return to the path of Torah. Live the life you're supposed to live. Conduct your affairs in a just and compassionate manner, and then God will show his favor upon you, and you will regroup. That was the end of the Haftorah. It's all going to be better. And the last words have to do with justice, right? We're going to build a nation based upon justice. And so the people of Israel put their eyes towards rebuilding after the first temple a new community with the permission, in this case, of Cyrus of Persia, based upon Torah and justice. And we have the whole story of Ezra and how he introduces the study of Torah. And the study of Torah becomes extremely important, and the people are very conscious of their purity and they're conducting their affairs in a compassionate and fair manner. And they're going to rebuild the state, and God's going to show his favor, right? But then the second temple is destroyed. What went wrong? Big problem. Because basically, they had not backslided to worship of false gods. The people were conducting themselves in a much better manner. So now what's the problem? Why did God not favor us? Why did God allow the Romans to destroy us? And the answer they gave was sinat chinam. The reason that you were destroyed, the second temple, is because of the internal conflict within your nation and the baseless and causeless hatred that you had for each other. That's the reason the rabbis give to the second temple. You so weakened yourself as a nation by fighting with each other, by insulting each other, by being petty with each other, that when you had to confront an enemy, you had no unity. You had no clear purpose how to work together to protect the nation, and you were overwhelmed. So the second temple is not because they were worshiping other gods, not because they didn't have any justice amongst each other, but because they simply hated each other. They were jealous of each other. They hurt each other internally. And that resulted in the destruction of the second temple. And that's how the rabbis interpret it. Now, why did I say that this helped preserve the Jewish people? Because instead of saying we lost because the enemy was stronger than us, and then we might as well just join the winning team. Give it up. Join the winning team. Life will be good. We said, no. It has nothing to do with they're stronger than us. We weakened ourselves. That's why we lost. So how do we fix it? Strengthen yourselves. Stop the causeless hatred. Find causes to unify around. Find compromises to keep the community strong. Treat each other respectfully. Doesn't mean agree with each other, but learn how to disagree agreeably. And then when this thing is settled, either in the courts or however a dispute is settled in the parliament or in the Congress or in the Supreme Court, learn to live with it, because that's how you keep the country strong. You can be upset with the decision that the rabbis make, or that the Knesset makes, or that the Congress makes, or that the Supreme Court makes, giving a perspective, but you have to live with it afterwards, because the unity of the nation and direction of purpose of the nation is the only thing that keeps it strong enough to withstand the outside enemies that every nation will eventually face. Because of that, the Jewish people were always in a self-correct mode. Right? We were always looking how we could repair the weaknesses that we had and become a stronger nation. So after World War II, when we're totally defeated, downtrodden, the leadership is gone, 1/3 of the nation is gone, we refocus, and Zionism becomes the answer to the problem. We have to have our own sovereign state. And Yitzhak Greenberg, the great Rabbi Yitzhak Greenberg, said at that time, after analyzing it, he said, you know what the greatest sin is of the modern Jewish world? Powerlessness. It is sinful for a nation to be powerless, because it leads to your destruction and your suffering. And so the Jewish people took that idea and said, we are going to restore our power in order to preserve our nation. And that was, of course, the goal of Zionism, was to create a nation that could protect the Jewish people. On October 7th, to a very significant degree, we failed. We failed to protect the citizens of Israel. We failed to protect, and it wasn't only Jews who were killed. We failed to protect our own Jewish people and our guests, people that we welcome, people who came to work on the kibbutzim from Thailand and places like that, people who came to celebrate the Nova festival from other countries or from within Israel who were not Jewish also suffered. So we failed to protect ourselves, and we failed to protect the stranger amongst us, right, the visitor. So it was an epic failure, and how do we rebound? It isn't because God punished us. We already got rid of that idea. It's because we had a weakness. And unfortunately, the weakness was the same weakness we had after the destruction of the Second Temple. Causeless and baseless hatred. Israel, the community, was in such intense disputes and fights with hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating for real reasons, legitimate reasons, but there was no air of compromise. There was just accusation, and there were threats, and there was a feeling that the other side was going to destroy the nation. And it became so powerful, those demonstrations and those disputes and the argumentation within the Knesset, that we lost focus on the purpose of the state of Israel to protect the Jewish people. Now there's a return to that focus, and hopefully it will remain so. Tisha B'Av then becomes a very important lesson. The first lesson is the first temple was destroyed because we abandoned the covenant. We ceased to live as Jews. So we lost our purpose, and we couldn't withstand the enemy that attacked us. The second temple, because of the causeless hatred. We weakened ourselves internally to such a point that we were not prepared for the single purpose of Zionism, and that is to protect the Jewish people. We had forgotten that. By October 8th, we recovered very quickly and realized what the goal was. What we don't know is whether or not the nation will be able to find compromise. It's no different in Western civilization. Many Western countries are suffering from very, very strong internal debates where there seems to be no compromise and where each one sees the other side as the destroyer, not one you disagree with, but someone who's going to destroy your very country, resulting in the weakening of the society, the fabric of society, and therefore weakening of our ability to defend ourselves, protect ourselves, and take care of our friends and neighbors who also depend upon us for their very existence, for their own security. So the lesson of Tisha B'Av is powerful. The idea of the conservative movement of a half a day of fasting and then break the fast to offer thanksgiving for the establishment of the state of Israel still seems to me the wisest response. But Tisha B'Av itself must be remembered because the lessons for the Jewish people and for every nation that values its own security and its own independence, Tisha B'Av is a universal lesson of how every single day you're in danger of losing that freedom, losing that independence, because there is always a Babylonia, and there's always a Rome, and there's always a Spanish Inquisition, and there is always a Haman in our midst, and we dare not lose focus on who that is and how we can strengthen ourselves to be prepared to protect our sovereignty and protect our citizenship. So we'll learn the lesson of Tisha B'Av this evening and tomorrow morning, and then we will begin the 7 weeks of consolation, 3 weeks of destruction, 3 weeks of focusing on the Puranut, on the destruction and the disaster of the ends of those first two empires, of those first two sovereign nations, and then 7 weeks of consolation, because there's always more consolation than there is disaster. That's been the positive attitude of the Jewish people, and that is what will strengthen our nation and begin to heal the divisions that have been caused by the October 7th disaster and by the inability of the Jewish people to unite around single purposes to guarantee our safety, our security, and our future. Shabbat Shalom.